is simply enjoying the taste of a makgeolli cocktail, enough to propel the industry into sustainable growth? Do consumers just need to taste something and think to themselves, wow, this is really good. I want to drink more of this. Does a deeper connection to history and culture matter if it's a product that tastes good to the uninitiated consumer? I argue that for makgeolli to achieve sustainable growth at home and abroad, consumers need to be able to distinguish makgeolli from its other alcohol counterparts across the world. Consumer education can play a major role. Consumer education can play a major role, teaching about its roots, its stories, and its complications that set it apart from other products in the marketplace. Another important component is in brewers producing traditional Korean alcohol that is authentic and full of integrity. Distinction is more than following passing trends. It relies upon being informed about the history of the brewing process, the history of the ingredients, how and when and why they changed, what they changed to, and what sort of identity is attached to that product. My goal today is to lay the foundation for you all so that you may have a greater understanding of the historical forces that have led to makgeolli's challenges today. First, let us explore what is makgeolli and how does it compare with other alcohols domestically and abroad. It's important to bear in mind that most commercially available examples of makgeolli are not representative of the traditional form, and are instead a product of the industrialization process that occurred during the Japanese occupation. Production cost, flavor consistency, shelf life, and distribution have been the guiding principles of makgeolli's modernization, resulting in a very different beverage from the examples of yore. Makgeolli is a fermented alcoholic beverage made from rice, water, and a unique fermentation starter called nuruk. Its name is derived from mak, which means rough, and golli, which means filtered. Makgeolli is unfiltered and is characterized by a sedimentary layer from which it gets its technical legal designation, which is takju. Makgeolli is typically served fresh or unpasteurized, though it is often pasteurized for the sake of shelf life and shipping purposes. The pasteurization of makgeolli kills off the live cultures in the brew and can dramatically weaken the flavor derived from live fermentation of yeast, lactic acid bacteria, and enzymes found in the typically wheat or rice-based complex called nuruk. The region where the nuruk is made and the unique local components of molds, yeast, and bacteria can profoundly affect the flavor of the resulting brew. Makgeolli is just one component of a given recipe yield. When you first filter a brew, you have what is called wanju. Now, if you look at the top layer, if you allow that wanju to settle in the fridge, it'll settle into two layers. And if you look at the top layer, you'll see chungju, which is clear yellow rice wine. And in the bottom, you have what is called takju. That's the rice sediment. If you add water to that, that's how you get makgeolli. Now you can see in today's tasting examples that There are examples of wanju, which is usually a higher alcohol beverage. In today's tasting, it's, I think, around 14%. And then Makgeolli, which is the watered down tokju, we watered down to around 10%. And the chungju has been provided by Nidam Brewery, and I'm unsure of the percentage. You know, Julia?
I'm not sure. Kimberly might know.
You'll find out later. So, most historical recipes were made with the purpose of deriving chungju. Now, chungju was reserved for the yangban, or aristocracy. And what was left over, the tokju, was reserved for the farmers, so as to not be a waste product. So that's why Makgeolli can also be known as nongju, farmer's alcohol. Prior to the 20th century, there were no breweries on the Korean peninsula, and alcohol could be bought at primarily jumak, or taverns. However, when Japan obtained unlimited control over Korea in 1910, everything began to change for Korea's brewing culture, as Japan made a more rigorous effort to control agriculture. In 1918, rice shortages in major Japanese cities, and the resulting riots, these are called the rice riots, led to a policy by the Japanese government that the empire be self-sufficient in food production. As a result, in 1919, the Japanese colonial administration introduced a modern alcohol taxation system called the Joseon. Before Joseon was introduced, there were roughly 200,000 brewers on the Korean peninsula in the form of jumak, or talents. After Joseon was implemented, the number of jumak was reduced down to 0. The Japanese administration permitted only one brewing license per area, and competition for those licenses was fierce among Korean citizens of privilege and connections. To be known as a son of Yangjodam, or brewery, was to be known as a person of wealth and means. The centralization of brewing made the alcohol business very profitable for those lucky enough to attain the position. In fact, the alcohol business was so lucrative that alcohol made up a full 1/3 of tax revenue for the Japanese colonial administration. Thus, similar to Western countries, alcohol became an important core of the taxation system. That legacy of Joseon lives on today, practically unchanged. When the breweries were centralized, the use of nuruk, Korea's traditional fermentation starter, fell out of favor as brewers switched over to the Japanese fermentation starter used in sake, called koji. Koji is known as ikguk in Korean. Commercial brewers at the time felt that koji was a simpler and more reliable fermentation starter for alcohol making. Koji differs from nuruk in that it is host to a single type of mold known as Aspergillus oryzae, whereas nuruk is host to a whole complement of molds and microorganisms. Aspergillus oryzae included The simplicity of flavor derived from the use of Japanese koji was one of the Korean brewing industry's first major departures from traditional Korean Makgeolli. As nuruk is so complex, it begets a really complex flavor. In sake tasting, there is a much simpler, very pointed flavor that is achieved. So, Additionally, a rich pantheon of traditional recipes passed down from generation to generation fell by the wayside as brewers transitioned to recipes geared towards the use of koji as a fermentation starter. This precipitated the decline of regional alcohols in terms of cultural knowledge and active brewing practices. Furthermore, the Grain Management Act of 1964 put an end to rice-based brewing practices as Korea coped with chronic famines due to the Korean War, agricultural shortages, and grain rationing. Brewers were forced to experiment with all kinds of available starches, including wheat, corn, and sweet potato, to mixed results. Around that time, Makgeolli began to lose ground in the marketplace to soju, as consumers lost faith in its once familiar character. The replacement of conventional crops with hybridized rice eventually made it possible for brewers to return to rice-based makgeolli. However, tastes were beginning to change as consumers found favor with sweetened and progressively weaker soju. In order for makgeolli to find its footing in the marketplace once again, brewers introduced sweetener. That could not be consumed by wise East Coasters. Saccharin, our favorite. When saccharin was eventually outlawed for use in food production, aspartame came onto the scene and has remained for decades. In fact, if you go to the store and you're looking for makgeolli, check the bottles. You will often see aspartame on the vast majority. As you can see, the commercial makgeolli we know today is not representative of Korea's long brewing history. The Japanese occupation and Korean War radically transformed the brewing industry, but at such great cost to rich cultural traditions. Through looking back at what was left behind and honoring principles of integrity and authenticity, we can safeguard Korea's cultural heritage as well as carry Korea into the new century. In this way, we can honor makgeolli's connection with Korea's historical and cultural roots. And that legacy can manifest in today's and tomorrow's marketplace. And to tell you more, I'm going to bring up Julia Mellor, who's going to tell you about today's marketplace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becca. That was an excellent introduction to where we are today. This is basically my job to tell you. The historical disconnects that Becca has gone through has basically set us up to what the makgeolli industry is today. And we've heard terrible stories. We've heard about rice shortages and occupation, centralization, all of these real struggles that makgeolli has had over the past 110 years. However, there was one moment in time that had a glimmer of hope. It was something a little bit positive that had everybody talking. And just like many things in Korea, it got its own buzzword. And it was something that was reported in many different articles, newspapers, all around the world, and everyone was really excited. And it was aptly called the makgeolli boom. Now you might hear this word get thrown around quite a lot. The makgeolli boom, actually there's been a few of them. But the most important one that we want to talk about, and incidentally its bust, is the one that started in 2010. It's so called the makgeolli boom because statistically every year the taxation officers check how much makgeolli is being sold, what are the imports, what are the exports. And then in 2010, they were shocked because they basically saw what could be round about this number, a 58% increase in exports and in sales. So they were sort of scratching their heads a little bit and thinking, what's going on here? This is not something that's normal for this particular drink. Incidentally, makgeolli has a very, very small share of the entire alcohol that is sold in Korea. At its lowest point, it's at about 4%. At its highest, it's 12%. It's still a very small market. So they're, as I said, scratching their heads. What was happening? And actually, it was nothing to do with the domestic market. It was from external forces. Japan. The Korean wave was actually not just about K-pop stars and K-movie stars and all these kinds of things. It was actually an opportunity, a quite subtle opportunity, to bring out Korea's culture, its food, all the other parts that make up what Korea is, to become more interesting to an Asian market, to the hopes and dreams were for a further afield market. Now, I don't know if many of you recognize this handsome young gentleman, but he is extremely popular in Japan amongst the ladies. He's an idol among idols. So, of course, in Japan, they marketed this. I mean, maybe you might not know, but makgeolli can come in cans these days. And this is a can of makgeolli. And when this hit the market, along with a couple of other K-pop stars and carefully placed advertisements, the market exploded in Japan. Everybody wanted to drink what this guy was drinking. And they're rushing to the stores to buy it, and this is what basically drove up that 58% sales ratio. So not to be outdone, the domestic market picked up on this. They said, hey, that's ours. What are we going to do about that? So during that 2010 period, what we saw, it wasn't that long ago, is the beginning of a real, genuine change in how the makgeolli industry is going to be developed. Foundationally, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Because of major players in the industry that before this time weren't really doing much. No fault of their own, as Becca mentioned, it was a really difficult time for makgeolli for the past century. So now we've got many, many different factors, many different spokes of the wheel that are driving the industry. But we could pretty much whittle it down to three major players. We have a new evolution in bars, in brewers, and in consumers. These three things are all intrinsically combined to create a new foundation for the future of makgeolli. And not just makgeolli, but actually all Korean traditional alcohol. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of how this all happened, or what actually has been happening since 2010. The bars. As Becca mentioned, chumaks, or taverns. They were essentially the breweries, because in the Joseon dynasty, actually having a commercial brewery was illegal. So many people would be home brewing, and they'd be selling a little bit on the side if people would come to your area. So if anyone of you have had that friend, it's raining outside, and they say, let's go, it's makgeolli time. Because makgeolli is always equated with rainy days. That steamy pajon, that big copper crispy kettle that has fresh, cold, refreshing makgeolli. That style of bar is today what we still call chumak. So it's those dark and dingy, they're round tables, and it's actually one of the best ways that you can enjoy makgeolli. And one of the most authentic in that way. However, 2010, makgeolli is getting really popular. Now domestically, we decided to make it a bit more trendy. So what we've got is no longer things, well, of course we still have those chumak styles, but we've got beautiful designed ceramic kettles. We've got upscale servers in a setting where it's not a place that you would genuinely think is a part of makgeolli. You've got beautiful design. You've got food pairing. You've got a whole different range. There's jazz. There's, it's a place you could take a girl on a date and she wouldn't She'll probably call you the next day, I guess. And so investing in this kind of style of drinking was very new. Now, not only the atmosphere of the bar has changed, the refrigerator changed. Usually in your chumacs, you would go to a chumak and you sit down, you say, I'll have a pajan and I'll have a makgeolli. And it'd come out in your kettle. And it was great, it was refreshing, it's delicious. But you have no idea where it came from. You don't know who made it, you don't know where it's been. That has changed. That still exists, but what now we've got are these bars are exhibiting brands. There are many different breweries across Korea that have their own particular label and their brand and their style. So these bars are giving the opportunity for consumers to learn who those breweries are. And what you're seeing now is brand recognition. People that drink a lot of makgeolli are now deciding which ones they like the best. And they'll only choose that one makgeolli until they find something better. That is key for how this future of this industry is going to develop. However, these are all positive things. And there's one change in the bar industry in Korea that some people argue is taking a step back, depending on who you talk to, if you're a bar owner, or if you're a brewer, or if you're a consumer. And that is the rise of slushies and cocktails. Honey poured directly into your makgeolli. Really colorful, candy-looking jugs. These kinds of things, for a purist, might get you a little hot under the collar, because you're basically just sweetening up makgeolli. I mean, we even have, for anyone that's been out in the bar and has had somek, which is soju and makju together, makgeolli has its own little character called maksosa, which is makgeolli, soju, and cider. Also, in my history, a recipe for total danger. But if you look at the things that we've got here, we've got slushies, we've got fruit cocktails, we've got honey. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what kind of flavor they're all aiming for. And it's sweet. It's very, very sweet. And this is key, because one of the driving consumers on the market today, whether it be for beer or wine or anything else, is actually young women. And for many young women, the taste of a really strong alcohol like makgeolli, that is, or other different styles of makgeolli, can be a bit confronting. So bar owners have come up with these special trendy ways to try and get people into the door and to be drinking their product. So as I said, you've got two sides of the fence here. The people that say, this is a great idea. Well, first are the bar owners making a buck. But number two are people in the industry that are saying, hey guys, makgeolli is still such a small percentage of the market. It doesn't matter that they're drinking something that you might not like, they're still drinking makgeolli. And then of course on the other side you say, you know what, that's great, but you know what, our industry isn't even solidified yet. We're not focusing on what makgeolli is. We're skipping to the trends and hoping to make money and get it a bit more popular. Whichever side of the fence you're on, it's a complex issue. However, if you're on the side of the fence that thinks that these colorful items are doom and gloom for the industry, there is much better news. The brewers. This is probably one of the most key developments in the industry. These people here are by no means all of the brewers. There's lots of different brewers in Korea. But these are some of the small batch artisans that are taking the time to learn the skill, research the process, experiment, really put their heart and soul into a drink that is creating something totally different to the makgeolli that you have experienced. For one, they use better quality ingredients. They're using a lot more rice, different variations of rice. They're using nuruk. All of them will use nuruk, because that was the traditional yeast starter of Korea's fermentation process. And they also don't water it down as much as, say, your regular makgeolli. So the ABV is quite high. It can be anywhere between 10%, and we've seen one for 19%. Careful with that one. It's a different experience. It presents its own challenges in itself. People think, makgeolli, it's that cheap drink. It's that one that gave me that terrible hangover that time. It's from the store, I don't want to drink that. But then you've got these people that actually are, a lot of them are, they're corporate people that quit their jobs as lawyers and bankers and said, you know what, I don't want to be a part of the rat race, I want to really create something with my hands. And they did, and it's amazing. But that jump, that theoretical jump from a product that can be found at corner stores and costs $1.20 compared to something like this, which has multiple levels of fermentation, which costs something like 20,000 won. There's no middle ground. So one of the challenges of these brewers is how do we get the consumer in the door to really appreciate all of the sacrifices that they're actually making in order to promote and revive a tradition that, due to many, many parts of the history that was out of their control, has gotten away from them. But there's one more. The bar owners are doing their best. The brewers are sacrificing and doing everything that they can. But there's one more factor that, quite frankly, without, me and Becca would be out of a job. And it's the consumers. You can do all these things, you can brew really well, and you can have a fantastic product, and you can have a beautiful bar, but if you can't get people to come in and drink your product, where are you? So for consumers, a lot of things are changing, or are beginning to change. It's a really important thing to think about is Makgeolli is a domestic product, and the vast majority of people drinking it are Korean people. So who is the Korean alcohol consumer? Quite frankly, only until very recently, many Korean people drink alcohol for a means to an end. It hasn't really been enjoyed as a beverage or something to be enjoyed. In really bad times of stress, or even the happiest times, you'll go to dinner and your table will be awash with soju bottles. Been there, it's been great. And it's great, it's still a great time. But really, that hand-to-mouth kind of drinking style has inhibited, it's so ingrained in the psyche that this is alcohol, this is what we should be enjoying as alcohol, presents a real challenge for people that would like to upgrade their drinking style and pay a higher price. Again, this is all tied into how the consumer makes that jump from a product that they've known for so long to be a cheap drink, to something that is of more quality and something that can be respected amongst its alcohol peers. There are changes though. I mean, we've got whiskey, we've got wine, and there are people that are really paying their money for these kinds of things, but quite frankly, there are still most of those consumers are drinking it for the price tag, or the image, or the style of where they are. There is a glimmer of hope, and it's an unusual glimmer. And it's in the form, in our opinion, of craft beer. As we mentioned before, one of the biggest driving markets of the consumer age today are young women. And the craft beer explosion, there's no other word for it, we're awash with craft beer. You can't turn left or right without craft beer. Most of the people buying that are young women that want to try something that's not really strong alcohol, but is a quality product they can enjoy with their friends. And that's kind of turning the tide in looking at alcohol from a different perspective. Looking at it as something like coffee, or like food, or tea, or something that actually, not for the sake of the properties that it has, but the quality of the drink that it is. And that's a pretty big statement to make, quite frankly. You can't actually see the visual link at the moment from beer drinkers turning into Makgeolli drinkers, or vice versa. But we are hoping that this could be a gateway to move people over from a long-standing tradition of drinking good quality beer. They might also be looking for something a bit special, a bit different, but is also really good quality. It's a big hope. So the question is now, this is where we're at now. So we've got bar owners, we've got consumers, we've got brewers, and everything is primed for greatness. But what are the problems? The Makgeolli industry has had so many problems over the past century, I should say. But we still have so many more. And it's frustrating. There's an article that was published earlier this year, and in about May, and it was talking about Makgeolli's hangover. I mentioned before the boom and then the bust. Again, such a buzzword. The exports have fallen, there's not much going on now. Obviously, Makgeolli is failing. It's not entirely true, however. Now, this article basically said there's three problems. The three biggest problems that we have to look at are aspartame. The dearest and nearest to our heart is aspartame. The stopping the use of aspartame in brews. Number two was the use of rice. Domestic rice versus imported rice. There are still a number of breweries that are using imported rice as opposed to domestically grown rice. And if you are brewing a traditional product, that can seem a little bit iffy. And number three is something that gets complained to us very regularly. Do away with those plastic bottles. The marketing image is dreadful. It's got so much work to do. Those three problems, I 100% agree with. They are all extremely important problems that we need to fix, but they are not easy. If you talk about many of the brewers that have been using aspartame for the past 20 or 30 years, and they have a 100-year-old history of their brewery, to walk into their office one day and say, change your recipe, now, it's really difficult. There's a number of factors you have to consider. You have to consider the consumers that already like your product despite using aspartame. If you don't use aspartame, what are you going to use? What's your brew going to taste like? It's like starting over fresh. I mean, we'll talk to you until the cows go home about stop using aspartame, but we also know it is not the easiest decision for a brewer to make. Plastic bottles, they're expensive. They're very expensive. And if you're a Makgeolli producer that only produces a certain volume, it's just, you're never going to make any money. Not only you're not going to make money, but you might even go bankrupt. Making the change from plastic to glass is a very big decision for a brewery. And number three, imported rice versus domestic rice. I heard there's a great big rice storage that has a surplus at the moment, and I say brew with it. That's something that we can change. Now, I agree with all these things, and I have no answers. I honestly couldn't. I was thinking, I was like, we know there's problems and challenges, but what are we going to fix? I can't fix these problems. But there is one thing that I think could potentially be the foundation for changing. And it's not those practical considerations. It's a simplistic, ideological consideration. It is a return to three things. Quality, integrity, and authenticity. If we consider the Makgeolli industry to be using these as a foundation of all the decisions that they make, that every time a problem comes up like aspartame, you're not going to be able to snap your fingers and change that. But if you approach every little problem by considering what we need to do for this industry is return to quality, and return to integrity and authenticity of the tradition of this drink, then those problems may have a way of finding their own way. Another thing that I think is more than just the ideology, there's other ways that are being neglected in the Korean traditional alcohol industry. Today we're talking about Makgeolli, but there's two others that are just as important, and that is Cheongju and Soju. It is extremely rare in the world's alcohol list to find three separate kinds of alcohol that are fatally intertwined with each other. If you want to make soju, you need to make Cheongju. To make Cheongju, the resulting product will be Makgeolli. These three children are all together with each other, and it's a beautiful thing. It's one of the best aspects of Korean traditional alcohol. But we are separating them. As soju is that green bottle, it's one of the most, I think I read an article once that said that soju is the most quantity, in terms of quantity, the most drunk alcohol in the world. That's nuts. And that's something that will never change. Accepting that we can never change that. But there is a whole different world in terms of soju. Soju that is brewed from rice, that is not watered down to 19%, but is held up to 25, 35, 40% sojus. If you haven't tried this, I highly urge you to at least try before you say, I will never drink soju again, which we've said many times, usually after a green bottle. But there are some really great things. Now, they are really difficult to sell because, again, we're talking about price point. And we're talking about a consumer. A little anecdote that is just a personal anecdote of mine about I often try and change people's minds about what they're drinking. And a good friend of mine, a woman in her late 40s, diehard soju fan. Every time we would go out, we'd drink a lot of soju. And her birthday was coming up, and I thought, easy, I've got this covered. I bought her a beautiful bottle of soju. It was 40%. It was one of my favorite sojus on the market. And I gave it to her. And I got this kind of look on her face where it was one of those, as soon as you see that look, you know you made a mistake. She looked at it and was like, oh, thank you. I went back to her house a couple months later, and I saw the bottle in her display cabinet with about one shot off the top. And I said, hey, what happened there? She said, I'm so glad you came over. Can you drink that, please? Because I'm not going to. I was like, what? This is great soju. And she's like, no. Give me my green bottle. That's soju. I don't know what that thing is that you gave me, but I want my green bottle. I was devastated, but then quietly took it home. So it was okay. But this kind of thing is what we're talking about. The consumers are going to be really difficult to change. But maybe we're looking at the problem differently. Instead of trying to change the consumers, there are a lot of people in the world, and there's a lot of people in Korea. Instead of changing a consumer, why not create them? Why not use this ideology of returning to craft and quality and all these things to create a whole new group of people that want to drink something good and support the industry in that way? Cheongju, the other issue that we have for makgeolli, especially for makgeolli, is it's a very, very difficult product to deal with. It's a live product. It's unstable. The taste changes regularly. The shelf life is short. And all of these things are incredibly frustrating, but give makgeolli all of its charms. So the way that we've been dealing with this issue in the past has been pasteurization. And when you pasteurize it, you've basically just killed it. You lose all the best qualities of makgeolli. You deal with the taste changing from the date of bottling to the date of its expiry date. Add sweetness. You just cheapened the character. All you taste is sweetener. So maybe, and this is just something new, this is just an idea, that what we're doing is looking at makgeolli and trying to tame it in a way familiar to us. We know wine, we know beer, we know whiskey, we know these products. Surely we can do the same for makgeolli. But just maybe, makgeolli will not be tamed. And that's what's beautiful about it. That's the whole charm. So it's our challenge, not just to return to quality, but to find ways in which we can support the drink. Because right now, the industry is not really doing it any favors. As far as Cheongju goes, Cheongju incidentally had its own boom. So it actually, in the 1990s, there was one company. There was one company called Goguryeo, which is one of the green bottles that you might be aware of. At that time, they weren't a makgeolli brewery. They were actually a noodle company because their father was a developer of a special kind of noodle called bio-noodle, which can actually break down raw rice, and is heralded as one of the great forethinkers in Korean brewing industries. He really wanted to open a brewery, and he was denied. Why? Because of those draconian laws that Becca mentioned before, that he didn't have the land, and they were only allowed to have a certain brewery in a certain area, and then he couldn't have it. So he petitioned amongst all the brewers and said, let's change this law, we need to change this law. And he was denied. So as savvy as he was at the time, he thought, you know what, there's Cheongju. And at that time, Cheongju only accounted for 1% of the entire alcohol industry. Why? Because cheongju is usually only used at Korean traditional ceremonies. It was never really a drunk to be of different kinds. Dry, sweet, carbonated, many different kinds. Why? And they just say, nobody wants to drink it. And I had that reaction. I think you're not trying. So I think one of the challenges of this industry that is actually going to, in the long term, help Makgeolli is exploring its cousins. Exploring the basic foundations of the Korean alcohol genre that it's just waiting there. There's so much potential. They're just waiting to be developed and to be consumed and to be exported and to be enjoyed. So I guess I've talked a lot of stories, both good and bad. But I want to leave on a message of hope and inspiration. The Makgeolli industry is an ancient industry, but in so many ways it's completely brand new. It's being reinvented. Through no fault of its own, for the difficult times that it's had over the past 100 years, it is trying something new. And there's mistakes. We're making lots of mistakes. But that's what we have to do to figure out what is the pathway that this alcohol can have in the future. So I actually have a request. Even if you tell one person, just one person, anything about what you learned tonight, about Korean traditional alcohol, even if you go to a bar and just ask, what have you got? What's new? What's different? Then that message can spread. And a new consumer base might actually be possible enough to make the industry respond and turn away from these trendy image about promotions and sales and exports and numbers. It's not a popularity contest. In fact, the Makgeolli industry has a long, long way to go. And that's okay. Because anything worth doing is worth taking the time. But it starts now. It starts very small. And I think that with everybody's help, and all of you people who are here tonight, we can get it done. So, without further ado, actually, there's one more aspect about the Korean traditional alcohol industry. I mentioned the brewers, and you might think, where did they learn that? When they quit their jobs as bankers and said, I'm going to be a Makgeolli brewer, how do you figure that out? There are actually a number of educational institutions across Korea that are teaching all of the recipe techniques. They're teaching dug-up recipes from long ago, and also giving people a foundation of creating their own recipes. One of those academies, so to speak, we have a graduate, actually, from one of those academies today, and she is going to come up and she's going to introduce... It didn't load. She's going to introduce her own perspective in terms of brewing. And also today, she actually has just come back from a place in Hongtan and visiting one of the brewers, and the brewer has kindly donated some of her product for your tasting this evening. So I'm just going to hand over to Kimberly, and she's going to give you a little bit of a background on her brewing and the tasting that we're having tonight. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to meet you on this side of the room. Normally I'm seated way at the back, peering over the sea of heads and always intently listening to lectures bi-monthly. I've been a RAS member for about 5 years. My name is Kimberly Buxton. 한국 이름은 김보라이고요. And it is my honor and privilege to speak on behalf of my cooperative of brewers. Pardon me, I'm suffering from jet lag. I got in on Sunday night at midnight after a 20-hour flight from New York. And today I spent a full day with my members helping our mentor to brew. And we rushed up here to reach you because, again, it is an honor to share why we have convened, and we are dedicated to reviving this authentic beautiful tradition and craft. Again, Chaju is a cooperative of dedicated brewers who are guided by 3 core values as we encounter the vast world of Cheongju, traditional Korean alcohol. Chaju, if you, by definition in Korean, the literal translation in Korean is Chaju, often. 자주 만나서 빚어야 된다는 의미로, so meet as often as possible to engage in the brewing practice as a daily ritual. We convene daily at our atelier to brew. The second value is 자연이 주인이다. Let's stay true to nature, not adding any preservatives or artificial flavoring, and stay true to the natural process of fermentation. And the third, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And the third value is 자가양주. So 가양주 is a household brew passed down through the generations. We share one roof, but we are finding our own personal recipe together under one roof. So handcrafting those in-house brews together. These are my wonderful cooperative members. Here go each one. So the 5 members up today, one is lactose, but I'm sure he's here in spirit. The cooperative shares a passion to revive and reinterpret what has become a neglected tradition, both in its craft and consumption, by researching classical texts dating nearly half a millennium, and also developing new technological capacity for on-site brewing for the contemporary times. We also have a researcher who's getting his doctorate, I think at UC Irvine, Tom. Unfortunately, he's back in the States, but we're basically his guinea pigs. And so he's going to take his findings and try to, recruit venture capitalists to see how he can make the appropriate technology for on-site microbrewing anywhere. So I think that's quite incredible. Very forward-looking, and I see great hope and potential in what he's doing. Chaju, again, engages in traditional practice, but it's actually here in Seoul, in a distinctively urban context. The cooperative is situated under one roof of a special project in a restored hanok called the 12 Moons, which is part of a greater movement to revive a very underappreciated neighborhood in Ikseondong. Do any of you know where Ikseondong is? Do you know what Nagamsanga? So before it was kind of a shanty town, kind of a red light district, and kind of outliers hung out there. But when you go through the back alleys, there are late Joseon era hanoks, and it has been a great initiative to revive those alleyways as kind of a cultural and arts space, which I find compelling, and which is why we've decided to situate ourselves there. Chaju, again, is part of 12 Moons as one of 6 in-house teams. So we're kind of a marketplace, a marché, I would say, where each enterprise has its own food and beverage enterprise and offering, and we share that center space, that mada, for production and also consumption and receiving of guests. Chaju is excited to be part of the neighborhood and community, and although we're amateurs, we cannot actually sell anything that we produce, but we're willing to share a glass or two of the full range of 전통주 we have just begun brewing and desire to develop as we envision this renaissance of a beautiful, beautiful tradition. Unfortunately, I had some pictures, but they didn't transfer. Today, we left at 8 a.m. and spent the entire day in Hongcheon, just assisting in one step of a 3-step fermentation brew by our personal mentor, Jongdam. I think her brew reflects the caliber of quality and craftsmanship that we aspire for, and we are humbled and honored to have her as our mentor to guide us as we embark on this journey and challenge. She has kindly offered her own Cheongju wine for this wanted to show a picture of her at least, but
It's okay. Just a point. Good try. Oh, the cord doesn't work on that. I can Google a picture of her. Oh, that's okay. Facebook is fine. So,
and hot off the press, at 5 p.m. we picked up our cards. I can't say they're business cards, but our cards for our cooperative. Actually, in fact, when I was contacted by Julia and Becca, to share this stage, we started preparing a brew for you. It's a tumultuous, so it's a brew that we hope to develop as a brand. We're calling it berry injection, 베리마치. Unfortunately, because of the drop in temperature, the fermentation process has been slowed, so it will be ready by the weekend. If you pick up this card, we will give you on site, in exchange, a bottle of that brew that we prepared for you. We would be honored to have you, and we will welcome you to our panel.
Becca also has brews for today, so why don't we introduce the brews, and we'll find a picture of Tomidam, and you can view her while you drink.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. So, in addition to the brew so generously provided by Midam Brewery, James So and I have prepared something else. So where is James? There's James. So James is my co-brewer for what we make for you tonight. We have made something called bokju, which is a traditional recipe from the Gyeongju region. You may know the commercial brand Gyeongju bokju. What we have provided tonight, you'll find taste quite different than the commercial brew, and because it's made with the traditional recipe. So you'll find there is a wanju, which is the pakju, the rice sediment, and the changju, the clear rice wine mixed together. It's undiluted, about 14%. And you will also find a pakju, a makgeolli, that has been diluted to about 10% alcohol. And then there are a few bottles of changju. So that changju and the pakju and the wanju all come from the same recipe. I wanted to show you how the same source can beget 3 different wonderful alcohols in the same family. And then also, James has provided a brew from the Makgeolli festival that happened this last October. He was a competition brewer, and he provided a cherry chongju made from the sobokju recipe. And it is dry and lovely and has a wonderful color. So anyway, I hope that you all enjoyed tonight, the tasting, and thank you so much for coming.